All right, good day, everyone. I hope you enjoy your weekend, guys. And how's your day so far? All right, that is good to know. So, for today's topic, I'll be happy to discuss or to tackle to all of you the elements of shading. But before that, I just want to ask if you have any idea what are those elements of shading? Yes, Abiera. All right, that's good to know. So I just want to ask all of you if you have any perception or what comes to your mind when we say elements of shading. Yes, Mansara. All right, very good perception about the elements of shading. So in this case, I'll be discussing now the elements of shading, okay? So, as we all know, shading is so important for art, especially in realistic. So, there are five distinct elements of shading that you need to know to be able to learn how to shade your art yourself. So, as you can see on the picture or on the presentation, we have here five elements of shading. These are the full light here. We also have here the half tone. We also have here the shadow edge, a reflected light, and lastly, the cast shadow. So these are the five elements, but some of these shading elements are on the object itself, while the others, just like this one, the cast shadow, are found on the surface the object is sitting on. So in this case, we're going to walk through these five elements one by one, okay? But before that, we're going to have an idea or I'll be going to give you an idea of what shading is. So on the screen it stated that shading refers on the depiction of depth perception in 3D models or illustrations by varying the level of darkness. So in short, shading is the process of adding value to create the illusion of form, space, and most importantly, light in a drawing. So it gives a more realistic look to your art or drawing. Okay, so on the screen we have here five different techniques or strokes in shading. So we have here the hatching, we also have here the cross hatching, this one. We also have here the scribbling, a circlism or a circling, and lastly the contour shadow. And these are the different strokes, okay? And how will you apply that? You're not just going to apply it on the object. So with that, with the help of elements of shading, we will going to apply it naturally and make more realistic your art. So first, at the end of this discussion or topic, I'll be expecting that you will go into understand the elements of shading and lastly to know and apply the tips of conquering the five elements of shading. Okay, so let's start. So the first elements of shading is full light. So as you can see, this is the full light. So in this case, the full light is this is where your entire shadow will ripple out from. So how will you figure out where your full light should go? So it's stated here that the direction of this ripple will depend on where your light is coming from. So for example, on this object or image we have here the full light, this one, and imagine that there's a light coming from in this part, okay? And this is where your full light is. And in general, the more angled your light is, the more angled your shadow will be. And on the other hand, also the more direct and bright your light is, the more dramatic your shadow will be. So a soft light tends to make it soft shadow. So to figure out where your full light should go, imagine that there's a straight line coming right from the light source that is hitting on the object. So again, imagine that there's a light here and there's a straight line and there you go. There's a full light on the object, okay? And just one more tip, think that your full light area is the epicenter of the shadow, okay? So any idea or any questions about full light? None? Alright, so let's proceed to the second one, which is the half tone. So as you can see on the screen, after your full light hits your object, it starts to spread and fade. So this is the halftone now. So always remember that there's a light source here, or imagine there's a light source here and there's a full light, and the halftone is the fading effects of the full light. Always remember that, okay? Remember that again, halftone is the result of full light fading away. So this one is the halftone, which means you have to create a fading effect. Okay, so any questions about the halftone? Alright, so in this case, your halftone will be generally be a shade of color halfway between the color you use for your full light and the color you will use for your shadow. Okay, so third one, we have here the shadow edge, and stated here that the shadow edge is where your shadow is going to be the darkest on your object, which means you're going to have your darkest and deepest tone. So in this object or example, we have here the shadow edge, which is the natural shadow of the object. So as you build your shadow edge, keep in mind that the ripple effect you get from your full light. So example again, this is the full light, this is the half tone, and this one is the shadow edge. So the shadow edge is depends on how big your canvas or object is. So your shadow edge might be far away from your full light, or keep checking back on your full light to make sure that the shadow edge is properly placed. Okay, so this one is the shadow edge. And the next one, we have here what we call the reflected light. So this element can be a little tricky because the source of the light isn't always clear. So as you can see on the image or example, this is the reflected light, okay, on the object. So most often your reflected light will show up on the outer edge of your object right before the cast shadow. So this is the reflected light, okay? Remember that. So it's the break in between your dark shadow edge and your dark cast shadow. So the cast shadow will be discussed after this one, okay? So your reflect always remember that your reflected light will be light, and it won't be as light as your full light, okay? Or even your half tone in most cases. So the reason why reflected light often looks I mean sorry, the reason why reflected light often looks so light is because it is sitting next to two dark tones, which is the shadow edge and the cast shadow. So lastly, we have here the cast shadow. This is what I'm talking about earlier to the reflected light. So the cast shadow is the shadow that is cast on the crown by an object. So the shape of this one will depend on the angle of your light is. So if your angle will so your so if the angle of your light will coming from here, and then the full light here, the fading or the half tone, and then the reflected light. So lastly, this is the cast cast shadow. Okay, so always remember that cast shadow is our final fifth element of shading, and as I've allotted this isn't actually included on your object, but the cast shadow is the shadow again that is cast on the ground by an object. So for example, a light that is shining higher will cause a smaller cast shadow, which is this one. So a light that is shining lower down or directly horizontal to the object will have a longer cast shadow. So if your light source will coming from here, the cast shadow will be longer and longer. Okay, always remember that. And a cast shadow is the effect that an object has on surrounding environment. So if you're not planning to draw the surrounding environment, you don't need to include it. Okay. All right. So any idea? Any question before we proceed to the tips? All right. None so far. So in this case, we'll be proceeding to the tips for conquering the elements of shading. Okay. So first, we have here to focus on one element at a time. So yes, you will be eventually need to master all five elements of shading, but You can start it one by one or slowly. So start by figuring out where your light source is and where your direct light will be the next element. So the second one, go back and adjust your work. So, as we mentioned in the cast shadow section, you might realize that you made a mistake when your shading work somewhere along the way. So, even though there are five distinct elements of shading, they all need to work together to bring your object to life. So continually check your work as day goes by or as you go and make adjustment as needed. Okay. And number three, use a light box to practice. So in this case, light boxes can give you a great way to practice your shadows. So grab a picture with intense shadows and use the light box to trace over them and get a feel for how they work. Okay. So if you don't have a light box, that's okay. You can use your iPad as a light box or a cell phone. And oh, number four. Number four, try different shading techniques. So just because there are five distinct elements of shading that you need to be honored, it doesn't mean that you can be creative and with how you express them. So try your hand at cross hatching, as I stated earlier, in stippling, blending, and smudging, and so on and so forth. So grab your paints, pencils, pens, or craft papers. So in this case, the best way to really master your shading is to practice it in a lot of different contexts and have fun with it while creating it. So, lastly, be patient and practice more. So, it may take you a while to master shading, yes, of course. I mean, there are five distinct elements that have to come together to make your shading work, but that's a lot, right? So, I know it's hard to stay patient when you're learning new art skills, especially when you see so much amazing shading. So, all in all, in the artwork you admire, better take your time and don't rush it, okay? So later on, you will improve your shading skills and eventually master it if you give time. Okay. So any questions about the topics for this day? Any clarifications? All right. So if there's none, we'll be going to have a self-check assessment and answer the self-assessment 2.3. Okay. So if you have if you don't have any questions now, I'll be ending this meeting now, okay? So goodbye and thank you for listening. See you on the next meeting, okay? Goodbye.